Hey everybody, Jane here, and I want to talk to you about the 11 books that I read in the month of December. I feel like December was kind of a crazy reading month and that I was kind of all over the place. I had books that I either absolutely loved or had books that really did not work for me. And there was almost nothing in between, which is not my usual. My last several months, I feel like, have been the opposite of just everything being kind of mid. And this month, there was nothing mid. It was all extremes all around. So let's start with the books that I did not finish this month, and there were three. And that is actually, I would say, a lot for me. I do DNF pretty frequently, but since I didn't try that many books this month, it feels like there were just a lot of books that weren't hitting. I think also I DNF'd a lot of these a little further into books than I normally do, except for the first one I'm going to talk about. And that could have something to do with why I feel like I had a lot of DNFs of what I was reading. So the first one that was a DNF for me was Boyfriend Material. This is a male-male fake dating romance. And I'd read, I believe, something else from this author that I really enjoyed, which is why I was looking to pick it up in the first place. I got it on audio, and I listened to about the first hour of it. This book didn't do anything wrong. It didn't do anything I could tell you, like, this is why I didn't want to read it. But for me, I just was about an hour in and I didn't care. And I have so many books that I want to be reading right now that to read a book that I just didn't care about when I had so many other options just wasn't going to work for me. So I was like, you know what? This just isn't for me, or at least not right now. So I put that one aside. The next book I DNF'd, I'm so sad about because the author is the nicest lady. I met her at an author event and I do follow her on TikTok. She is wonderful. Her book just was not for me, and that is The Blood Eagle. And this is by A.L. Hatcher. And A.L. Hatcher is a lovely lady. If you ever get a chance to meet her, definitely go up and talk to her. Also, just because a book wasn't for me doesn't mean that this book won't be for you. Just throwing that out there, because I never want anybody to be like discouraged from reading a book, especially by somebody I believe is an indie author, just because somebody else didn't like it very much. So in this book, we have Tess as our main character, and she is a patrol cop. So nobody super important. We do learn that her dad is a retired policeman, and I don't know if that comes into play later or not. But there has been a gruesome murder, and her name has appeared at the crime scene. And so even though she's not a detective who normally would get wrapped into this kind of thing, she is brought into the investigation to try to figure out what is her connection to this murder. I will tell you, I loved the murders themselves. They were very creative. There was more than one, as far as I got. And it was a very interesting setup. Now, that being said, there were several things that just didn't personally work for me. The first one is very early on in this book, we get the murderer's POV. And that can work for me in some books, but in this one, it wasn't building suspense. It was just telling me a little about them, and I kind of became less interested because the other part of the book is set up like a police procedural. And in this case, I'm like, I'm not really trying to figure out who done it because I already know who done it, and I have ideas and suspicions about why. I didn't get far enough to know that for sure. But I was just like, okay, I'm less invested in the actual plot. And that happens to me sometimes. Mysteries, thrillers, they're not always my thing. The other issue I had was that I wasn't invested in the characters either. So Tess is our main character, and I didn't feel like we had a lot of character development that would make me care about her. She is there, she is present, but I felt like the focus is largely on her relationship with this guy, and I wasn't invested in their relationship. He is a little bit older, more mature. I believe she's 23. And I don't think we're given his age, but he is a widower with an 8-year-old child, so probably a bit older than her. He was also her mentor at the academy. And as far as I got, it looks like it's coded for a romance. I don't know if a romance actually is going to happen, but the relationship made me uncomfortable. I didn't like it. And because I wasn't interested in the mystery and I wasn't interested in the characters, I just didn't feel like finishing this book. I will also say I felt like at times there were some lapses in logic. I know that this writer really researched this book, so it could be that they were using things that were realistic as opposed to typical for the mystery genre, which I read a ton of. So it's possible that this book is just too really realistic for me, but there were a lot of times where I'm like, I don't know if that's how this is done. I don't know if that makes sense. Similarly, Tess being dragged into the investigation and being able to like actively participate in it. I know when I've watched other crime scene and crime shows and read other mystery books, typically if somebody seems like they're involved in some way, they're kept away from the scene and they're fighting the whole time to be able to give input, and you know, they're working around the other detectives. And in this case, Tess is just brought right on board and investigates. And I don't know if that is how it would really work in a police station. I know for like the tropes and genre, typically the argument is if you are involved, you're going to cause problems. And if you're not involved, you're going to make it very hard to prosecute this. So yeah, so I just felt like there was a lot of things that didn't really make sense to me, and maybe I was missing stuff. I'm not sure, but the author did say that they did a lot of research for this book. So possibly some of the other things I noticed were just research overtaking typical mystery tropes. I'm not sure. It wasn't for me. She's a lovely lady though. If you get a chance to meet her, you know, she's wonderful, but this book just didn't work for me. The next book, sadly, is also an indie author I met. And here's the thing. I love indie authors. I am one. And I want to support indie authors where I can. But at the same time, I'm also going to treat them exactly like I would any other author and give you my honest opinions about their books. And I'm trying to do that. And I know sometimes people are like, well, they're indie, you shouldn't be harsh or critical. And I'm trying not to be harsh or critical. I never try to be harsh or critical of any writer. But I do want to tell you, you know, these books sometimes are just not for me, and that's okay. And this one is called On Ice, and it is a ice hockey romance. We have the girl who, let me see if I can, Elise, and she is a PR person who has, I believe, recently lost her parents. And she has upended her entire life to become the PR person for this hockey team, and particularly for Liam. Liam is the guy, and he has been causing all kinds of problems. So, some time ago, and there's some confusion, I think, early in the book about how long ago, his fiance, who was pregnant with his child, was hit by a drunk driver and died, and he is not handling that well, which makes a lot of sense, and I think most people wouldn't handle that well. So, he's been causing all kinds of problems for the team and for the image, and the people in charge are like, yo buddy, you gotta get this together. So they bring in Elise to try to help him, you know, improve his image, things like that. That's the setup. I had a lot of issues, and I think some of them may actually just be this genre. I am currently working on a video where I read sports romances, and I think sports romances just may not totally be for me. I've had a couple that I've enjoyed as I'm reading these, but they are typically a little bit too lusty for me, and this is another one that felt that way. As soon as Liam sees Elise, he's all like, I haven't been attracted to anybody since my fiance died. This girl's hot. And right away, she's like, this guy's hot. And for me, that's not what I want in a romance. I want characters being around each other, getting to know each other, especially with his recent tragedy. Like, and we're given the impression from Liam initially that it was just because it's in a dual POV, and in his POV it seems like his girlfriend just died a few months ago with his baby. I mean, then the fact that he's being like, oh, this girl, she's cute, I like her, I haven't liked anybody since my girlfriend, but this girl's cute. That, especially if it was only a few months, rubbed me wrong. A little later in the book, you do have another character who tells Liam it's been almost a year. And I think that maybe changes the dynamic a little bit, but still, these characters, it just felt very lusty to me, and I wasn't seeing any connection or chemistry beyond, oh, they're hot and I'm into them. And that doesn't work for me in romance. I know some people like that. That is definitely not for me. Another thing that I had an issue with, and this is a small complaint, is we are told Liam's been causing all these problems, but I didn't necessarily feel like we got to see the things he's doing that are a problem. The closest we come is she comes into the locker room and is upset about something, arguing with him, and he picks her up and tosses her over his shoulder without her consent. And I think that's meant to be a really cute, funny, romantic moment, and it didn't really work for me. But also, I think because we haven't really seen him misbehave, it seems like she's just kind of going off on him when it just didn't, I didn't see that. So again, this is another case where the author is so nice. I got to meet her. She is lovely. If you love hockey romances, this might work a lot better for you than me. And if you don't mind like insta lust and don't mind that, at least as far as I got, which was about 50 pages in, these characters are just kind of mooning over each other, but not genuinely liking each other or interested in each other because they don't know each other. There's also, if I recall, like a 2-month time jump early in the book. And for me, that's too much. I need to know what's going on, like in a lateral way, in a linear way, until we're established. And it just, yeah, this just wasn't working for me. But again, it could work a lot better for you. I wanted to love this. And I don't know if this is a very typical sports romance and doesn't work for me, because I've DNF'd a lot of sports romance in this whole like trying to read sports romance thing, or if other people will feel also that it was kind of insta-lusty and the characters weren't really connecting. I don't know the answer. Didn't work for me. All right, so of the books I finished, I had a 2-star. And if you typically follow my channel, you know 2 stars are incredibly rare for me. So I only give a book a 2-star if I think there were things that are fundamentally wrong with the book. I don't think the book is unreadable, but I think the book does things that are objectively bad, not just things that I don't enjoy. Sometimes a book I read and it's not for me, but I don't think I can't pinpoint like this is just fundamentally bad. We had one of those though, because if I have something that I can say, this feels objectively bad, that is when I give a 2-star, and that's the only time. And I have a 2-star. And that is The Devil's Cold Dish. Now, a couple things. This is book 5 in the series, and I've been reading the series and enjoying the series. So that was a huge blow that I didn't like this book like at all. And I'm legit mad at this book. So this is the 5th book in the Will Reese mystery series. Will Reese was in the Revolutionary War, and he came back, he got married, he became a weaver, and while he was in the war, he solved some mysteries, and he has a reputation as somebody who can solve mysteries, and now in his life as a weaver, he solves mysteries occasionally. So a couple things that I need to note, just for fairness of this review. The other books I have all listened to on audio, which could have changed how I perceive them or read them. I know audiobooks and visual reading are not quite the same. This book, my library didn't have as an audiobook, so I had to read it, so that could have definitely changed my enjoyment. I don't think it did, but I want to clarify that. This book also, just so you know, in case you would like to read the series, you really should read these books in order. There is a lot of character arc happening. This book, I think, felt in a lot of ways to me like a filler, and that it was trying to just get to the next thing that needed done in the series, and that's part of the reason it fell apart for me. In this, Will Reese is home, and he has a sister who has been begging for his help. So in 2 books ago, Will and the sisters got into a fist fight, and the husband had attacked Will. So Will was not at fault. He was just defending himself. And he punched the guy, and the guy fell back and hit his head on a rock and suffered what probably today would be diagnosed as a traumatic brain injury. So the guy is no longer very capable of managing the farm. So you have the sister who is in there and is like, we need your help. You're letting my children starve. And Will is trying to help, but also he and his sister have a lot of bad blood between them, and he doesn't want her to take advantage of his kindness. And he's got some complicated family stuff going on. Suddenly, people start dying in town, and it's clear that somebody is trying to frame Will and his wife, Lydia. They are trying to make it look like Lydia is a witch and is killing people in some kind of sacrifice to the devil, maybe. And Will is trying to clear their names, protect his family, etc. It's not a terrible setup. But my issue was none of the characters acted the way they've acted in previous books, except for maybe the sister. Everybody was acting really out of character, including Will, because in this book, they make it seem like he's always had problems with the neighbors, and he's like always been a brawler and this and that and this. And in the other books, I don't recall that ever being something that was really brought up. He seemed to be really well respected. I also felt like Will, from the beginning, was sure it was his sister and kept trying to pin things on his sister, which kind of was a problem. Like, yeah, your sister is horrible and you're having all these family issues, but also, like, she's a woman in a desperate situation. And in the very last book, you said you were going to try to be more understanding because you dealt with a woman in a bad situation and were aware that the options for women in this time are limited. So all the character growth you had in the last book, you don't have now, which really irritated me. Like, come on, Will. Remember the last book? You just learned that you need to be better to your sister. Anyway, I felt like the characters were not acting consistently. I felt like people were making really bad choices. And without spoiling, I felt like the resolution to the mystery was a little problematic. And this is not the first book that the author has been a little bit problematic with. And it's a different kind of problematic than the other books that I thought were kind of problematic. But I felt like this was a little bit problematic. I didn't like it. I am going to read one more book in the series. The reason I started reading this series to begin with was I won book number 6 in a Goodreads giveaway, and I opened it to read it, and it was like clear that there was a lot of character arc stuff that I needed to catch up on before I could read that book. I'm used to mystery series where you can kind of pick up a mystery anywhere in the series, read it, and not be too far behind. That was not this series. And so I'm definitely going to read the last book that I have, which is number 6, to get caught up. And then if it's kind of a letdown, I probably won't continue the series. I really enjoyed the 3rd book in the series a whole lot, and I liked the other books but didn't love them. Book 3, I think, was a 5-star. I really loved it. But I don't want to keep going with the series if I'm not enjoying it, and I really hated this one, so we'll see how the next one goes to see if I want to continue on or if I just want to call it a day after I do the obligatory Goodreads review of the book that I won a couple years ago, I think it is, because I've been trying to read up to this point. So yes, that was my only 2-star of the month, but it was frustrating. As I said earlier, I have no middle of the road books, so I had 0 3 stars, guys. Not a single one. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but not a single 3-star. So let's move on to the 4 stars. My first 4-star was ABC Murders. This is a Poirot mystery. I feel like most people know who Poirot is. He is a detective in the Agatha Christie Poirot series. In this, we have murders happening, and they seem to involve letters. So the first person who is killed, I believe, is a shopkeeper, and I don't remember what her name is, but she is found in her shop having been clearly murdered, and her shop and her last name and her town both start with the same letter. And the same happens with the second person that they find dead and the third person that they find dead. And Poirot is investigating, and he's actually getting people who were familiar with the other victims or with the victims to help him in the investigation. So he's getting family members from people and being like, hey, can you come and help me investigate? And in each of the murders so far, there has been like a clear suspect, but each of those suspects has a really strong alibi of why it couldn't have been them. So they think, oh, do we have a serial killer on our hands? Because, motive and stuff. I already knew that there was a twist in this one, and I knew what the twist is because I read 8 Perfect Murders, which talks about this book. It was a good Poirot. It wasn't one of the best. It's fairly mid-level for me, but I like Poirot, and I enjoyed it, and it was a good one. So that's what I have to say about that one. The next one was a thriller, No One Can Know. In this, we have a woman who she just found out she's pregnant, and her boyfriend just lost his job. So they are in a really tough financial place, and they decide that they are going to move back to her childhood home. Now, her parents were murdered in her childhood home, and so the house has been vacant, just with like a caretaker coming in and mowing the lawn type thing. She can't sell it because her sisters have to agree to sell it too. One is younger and one is older. So she's the middle sister. And they would both have to agree to sell it in order for them to be able to get rid of this house. On top of it, the sister who is moving back, is the prime suspect in the murder. And the police were really looking at her as the murderer in the previous timeline. And it is dual timeline. So we get what happened before, what happens modern day. So she was the prime suspect. She says she didn't do it, and she tells her she's never told her boyfriend any of this as they're moving back home. She's like, by the way, my parents were murdered in this house. Oh, and they think I did it. So she's going to this town that thinks she's a murderer, and she's trying to figure out what happened to clear her name before her child is born, and also just to kind of get closure and figure out what had happened, because she was a child when all of this went down. I want to say she was 15, so I mean a teenage child, but still very young. Her and her sisters were all minors at the time. And maybe she was 14 and her older sister was 16. I don't remember exactly. I just know. So anyway, she's back to try to figure out what happened, to figure out who killed her parents, and to clear her name. I really enjoyed this. It did some cool things. It kept me interested. There were parts that were predictable. Thrillers aren't always my favorite. I love reading thrillers, but often they let me down. This didn't let me down terribly. It was just okay, this was a good one. I enjoyed it. Don't have a ton to say other than it was a good time. The next and last 4-star I had was Barbarian, Seduction. If you've been following this channel, you also know I'm reading through the Ice Planet Barbarians books and generally like them. This one was okay. It is probably in my lower tier. I didn't actively hate it, but I didn't love it. I liked it moderately. And this is a story of Marlene and Zenek. And this is a flashback to before. So for those who aren't familiar with the series, a group of girls are kidnapped by aliens and land on this ice planet, and the local people take them into their tribe, and they have like a fated mates system of falling in love. When the author wrote the series, from my understanding, she didn't think she was going to be writing as many books in the series as she did. I think she was contracted originally for 3 books, if I recall what she had to say about it. So, a lot of the couples coupled up really quickly and off stage in the early books. So, basically, in the first book, as soon as the barbarians show up to rescue the girls from the ship, which happens at basically the end of the first book, everybody starts, not everybody, a lot of people start getting matched off. And Marlene is one of these. And so we get her and Zennik's story, but as a flashback, because we are so far in the future now. They have children. I think they have just one, but they have a child. And, you know, this is her flashing back to what happened. And it's kind of contextually related to what's happening now. There is some superstition thing she's worried about. There's, I think if I recall, a big snowstorm, and her husband and daughter are out in the snowstorm, and she's worried about them. And so she's thinking back to how she knew when she first landed on the planet that she was going to be okay, because she kept seeing these things that she considered were signs from her mother. Her mother has passed away, and she always felt like her mother was sending her these signs, and she's seeing these signs, or she's looking for these signs now to make sure that like her mother is telling her her daughter and husband are okay, and she's not seeing them, but she's telling us how when she got to the planet, she kept seeing all these signs. It was cute, the superstitious stuff. I will say I listened to this on audio and I didn't love it, and part of that was Marlene has a very strong accent. She's one of the only characters up to date that does. She is French, and while I think it was cool that they added a storyline of, you know, they have to go and deal with the language situation because she's French, a little different than they have to deal with the language situation because everybody else speaks English. So I thought that was a cool thing to add. It gave them something to do. Some of these are kind of minimal plot-wise. Again, like we're 15, 16, 17, however many books in. I'm getting close to being finished with that first series. So there's 3 series. There's the main series, which is what I'm reading right now. There's Ice Planet Home, and then Clones. And I've read the first of Home and the first of Clones. So I do plan to read all of the books in the series. I'm enjoying them still. Some of them hit harder than others. This one was fine. A little bit of a miss for me. All right, so now let's move on to my 5 stars. And I had quite a few 5 stars this month. I did. I was very impressed with it. All right, so the first 5-star was actually another one of the Ice Planet Barbarians, and that was Barbarian's Beloved. This one was also a flashback. So we have Ariana and Zolea, and they are looking back on when they got together, or she's telling an edited version, I think, of it to her child, maybe, as they are going about their day and doing the things that they're doing. So they were another couple that got matched early on. And interestingly, she has anxiety and doesn't have anxiety meds with her. And that was one of the issues in the story. I think present day, she was having like a recurrence of her anxiety attacks. And when they first landed, she had trouble making friends because she was so anxious. She was crying a lot. She was obviously not doing well because of not having her mental health meds. And Zolea was very kind and understanding, and like she was able to explain to him what was going on because they don't have anxiety in their world. Their world is a lot different, and to be like, hey, I have this medical condition and your healer can't fix it. At home, I take medicine to control it, but we don't have that medicine here, and them being able to deal with it. So there is a little bit of a, if you don't read the Ice Planet books, there's a thing that helps take care of a lot of their medical needs. And so that's not usually a thing in this world, but for certain things, like apparently mental health things, you can't, it doesn't fix it. So I love the anxiety rep, and I loved her story, and I really liked her and Zelaya as a couple a lot more than I liked, for instance, Marlene and Zedek. So I really enjoyed this one. It was a good time. And that seems to be how the Ice Planet books are with me. Sometimes they really hit, like the characters in the story just give me the warm fuzzies and I love them, or they don't and I just like them. And that's okay too. Not every book has to be a win. The next 5-star I read was Somewhere Beyond the Sea. This is the sequel to House in the Cerulean Sea. And I'm going to give an unpopular opinion. I like this one better. I will tell you I listened to it on the audiobook, and I would not recommend the audiobook. I thought the audiobook was very over the top. The first book I read, and this one I audio read, and I thought it was a little over the top. So the setup is we have this foster home. It's not really an orphanage, but it's like a foster home for children in this world that have supernatural gifts. And the government wants to shut down this home. They're concerned about whether these kids are getting the care they need, or they say they are anyway. And our leader of this home is a man named Arthur, who we met in the first book. The first book, House in the Cerulean Sea, we have Linus, who has come in as a social worker to make sure that this foster home is up to snuff. And he and Arthur fall in love. I don't think that's a spoiler. The second book really focuses on Arthur, which I think works well because I did not like Linus. And I think Linus is an okay side character, but I don't think that he is a good main character. At least he wasn't for me. I hated him. He does have a redemption arc. I still didn't like him. This book, he's tolerable. I didn't mind him. But this book is really Arthur's story. Arthur had been a foster child in the system because Arthur also has supernatural powers. And it is largely him talking about what he went through, and then concerns about keeping these children safe when the government seems absolutely dead set on doing everything wrong for these kids. This book talks a lot about prejudice. It talks a lot about hatred, and it's very on the nose. I can absolutely see where some people might not enjoy this because, number one, it's kind of the same setup in some ways as the first book. You do have another social worker coming to the house, although she is has an Umbridge quality to her. So unlike Linus, who legitimately was concerned about the children, this lady is very much like, you didn't teach from this textbook that you're supposed to teach. You aren't fit to parent. And it's like, wait a second, your textbook is full of hate and racism, basically. Like, I don't know if you call it racism, but whatever it is that is like hating on these powered kids, like, your books are terrible. Yeah, we're not going to teach them that they're awful people because they have powers. We're not doing that. So I really liked this one, but I definitely can see where it's divisive. Some people love it, some people don't. If you loved the romance in House in the Cerulean Sea, you're not going to get any of that. Like, not really. If you loved the children and the foster care and the discussions and the big picture discussions about prejudice and things like that, this hits wonderful. Obviously, it's LGBTQIA, which is also lovely. The only complaint I have about this book, other than I didn't like the audiobook, I felt the audiobook made it too cartoonish, which has already got a cartoonish feel to it. And that was a problem I had with Cerulean Sea, is that it read very cartoony, and this one also reads cartoony, and then the audiobook takes that even another step. So there's a really good story underneath, but I found it hard to get to that story based on the narrator of the audiobook, but not necessarily as much this time for the story. Maybe because I was used to it because we did Cerulean Sea. The other issue I have is the way that things are resolved in the climax didn't really work for me. I thought it was too hand-wavy, or wasn't set up well. So I didn't love that. But I loved all the foster care rep. I loved all the discussions about prejudice. I loved the children. They're my favorite part. It was just a lovely feel-good book, and I enjoyed it a lot. I liked it way better than Cerulean Sea, personally. The next book I gave 5 stars was the Bromance Book Club. As I said, reading sports romance. This is sort of a sports romance. So our guy is a professional baseball player. And I will say, and this may or may not matter, baseball is the only sport I understand-ish. I don't know how basketball works. I don't know how hockey works. I don't know how soccer works. I'm not a sports person, but I kind of understand baseball. When I was a kid, my dad would take me to baseball games, and I basically understand how it works. It is not super important in this book, which is probably another reason that I enjoyed it, even though it's a sports romance. This is a second chance romance, and I believe the word is meta. It is very, very, if I'm using the word correctly, meta. It is a romance book. It knows it's a romance book, and it's talking about romance books. So, our main guy, Gavin. Our main guy, Gavin. Him and his wife have had a falling out, and he has moved out. Okay, their marriage is done. She's said she wants a divorce. She is over this. And he is devastated. He is drinking himself basically to death. His teammates come and go, bro, we're going to solve this. We're going to fix your marriage because we need you on our team and we need you healthy and able to do your job. And he's like, there's no fixing it. It's too far gone. And they're like, listen, friends, we have the solution. You're going to read romance novels. And he's like, I'm going to what? Yes, friend, you're going to read romance novels and use the information that you learn about women in these novels to get your wife back. There are such good discussions about why women read romance, what we learn from the romance genre, a reminder that romance is basically written by women for women. So if you want to understand women, romance novels are really the way to go. Is it sometimes a little too much? Yes. Is it silly? Yes. Is it goofy sometimes? Is it over the top? Absolutely. Is it a little steamy at the end? Yes. Maybe too much? For me. But I loved this, and I loved all of the romance book stuff coming in and him trying to use it to get on board with his wife and to learn what his wife needs. Gavin is a flawed character. The reason that they are having the issues they're having was irritating. I think it's realistic. I think that is the most realistic part, is like the things that cause the problems in their marriage. But I love this. It felt so good to read. It was lovely. I had a good time with it. And I love romance books. So the fact that it was a little bit, again, I think I'm using the word right, meta, worked so well for me in this particular instance. It knew it was a romance book. It's talking about romance books, and it hit so well. All right, the last book I read that got a 5-star, and I will tell you, initially I was on the fence between a 4 and a 5, but as I sat with it, I decided it was a 5. And that is Don't Want You Like a Best Friend. This is a Regency romance that is female-female. It is about these 2 girls, and they find out that their parents had dated each other or been into each other, but ended up both going off and marrying other people, and both parents are widowed. And the girls decide that they are going to bring their parents back together. So kind of like Parent Trap, except that as they're trying to get their parents to fall in love, they're falling in love. This book is not without flaws, and I want to be very clear about that. And I think that's one of the things that made it very difficult for me to decide whether it was a 4 or 5. I loved it, most of it. I thought it did a lot of really good heart-pully things. I had a great time with it. It made me cry. It was lovely, but I think it has a lot of flaws, and depending on what you want in a book, this may not be a 5 for you. So I'm going to try not to spoil too much, but briefly, it starts very slow. And at the beginning, neither girl realizes that they like girls. It takes them a while to get into them being more than just friends. I would say this is kind of a slow burn, friends to lovers book. I think that is fair to say because they keep thinking they're friends, this is my best friend, this is my best friend, only to realize, oh, oh, I like them as more than a best friend. So I do think that it took a while to get there, and I was a little bit bored at the beginning. I didn't hate it. I was just like, okay, come on. This is supposed to be a romance, and it's more of a parent trap, goofy rom-com thing with the parents, not the children. So I did think that was a little bit annoying, but once we got into the meat of the story, it was really good. I loved the discussion on the difficulties the LGBTQIA community had in the past and in history, and I mean, still have today, but in the historical lens, really bad, and how it was dealt with or not dealt with in some cases. And there was so many good conversations about women and their rights and how women managed to be LGBTQIA in this time period, and just so much good stuff, along with a really interesting romance of not only are these girls trying to navigate we like each other and this is my best friend, but also in a world where people aren't cool with this, how do we get a happily ever after? And what does happily ever after look like for us? That being said, on a realistic thing, I had a couple issues with the reality of this book. Number one, there are so many allies in this book. And in many ways, I think they had a much easier time of things than real people in with same-sex attraction would have back in the day. So there is nothing but supportive people surrounding these girls once they realize what's going on with them. And I think, I imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, that would have been a lot harder to find in reality. I mean, there are kids now in modern day who are LGBTQIA who are struggling to find support and allies. You're telling me back in the 1800s, these girls would be just surrounded by absolutely wonderful people who are supportive of them despite the fact that they're into girls? I don't know that that's realistic. And so I think it works well for the story because everybody in the inner circle is very much like, oh, you like girls, okay, that's fine. But like then there's the outside in society that, you know, they don't look at it that way, but we do. So I don't think that was realistic, but I think it was wonderful for storytelling, if that makes sense. Another thing that I'm going to say is there is some steam, and without being too detailed, I was surprised at what Victorian women traditionally, or Regency women, would have traditionally known prior to being married, presumably, was very little, in my understanding. Like, most people on their wedding days didn't know what they were doing. And these girls obviously have no context and nobody to explain to them how things work. And they just figure it out real nice and easy. And granted, these girls are in their 20s, but they didn't even know up until like a couple chapters ago that they like girls. And all of a sudden, they got this down. You know, they got it figured out. And I didn't think that was super realistic. And I kind of wanted more like context, like, what are we doing? How do we do this? What is this? And there was none of that. They just were like, oh, we like each other. Boom. And I was like, oh, okay, you got that figured out real quick and easy there. You know, most people don't, but you got that. And then my final 2 complaints-ish. And that is how this ended. And it did end with a lot of historical questions. Like, they are in the historical time period, so it can't be all neat happily ever after. And their happily ever after looks different than what a happily ever after would look like in other Regency novels that have a male and a female. And that had to happen, obviously, because of the story. I think it was satisfying, but I think some people will be uncomfortable with it. I also would like to point out they succeed in getting their parents together. So this, by the end of it, becomes a stepsister romance. And like, I don't think the author necessarily thought that through, because I don't know if that's something that's going to bother other people. But like the whole time I'm like, these parents aren't really going to get together, right? Because then they will be stepsisters. Do we want to be sisters? Is that okay? Are we fine with that? Oh yeah, they get together and we're stepsisters now. And I know that's not for everybody. And they don't make a big deal out of it. It's not like, oh, she's hot because she's my stepsister type thing. But still, I know that some people, that's a little bit of an ick. So if the step sibling thing is an ick for you, this may not be the book for you. But yeah, I generally I am aware that it is not necessarily a realistic to the time period book, but I enjoyed it and I had a good time with it and I got all the feels and I cried. And so I rated it 5-star, even though I was on the fence for a while, because I generally rate 5 stars based on enjoyment. And I knew it was a 5-star in enjoyment, but I thought it had a lot of issues that could bring it down to a 4-star if I thought about it too hard. I chose not to think about it too hard and decided it was a 5-star. All right, guys, those are the books I read in December. Please tell me about your December reads. What was your best read? What was your worst read? Did you DNF any books? Did you DNF a lot of books? Do you DNF? Whatever you'd like to talk to me about book-wise, leave it in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. This has been Jane. Bye! Pictures and patterns put into words that stream across the page.